And here's Ken.
Two war heroes and a shad bake. Most historians have suggested that the single most defining occurrence in American history is the Civil War. The Civil War is America's Iliad. Most would agree further that the watershed, the turning point of that war took place halfway through the war in a battlefield in southern Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. The outcome of the Battle of Gettysburg was decisively settled as the result of one 45-minute assault. It was a frontal assault made by the Confederates. It has ever after been called Pickett's Charge. It failed, and tragically so. So thus it might be said arguably that the single most important 45-minute interval in our entire national experience took place on that afternoon in July of 1863. The attack was planned by Confederate General Robert E. Lee. It was led by his subordinate general, General George Picket. 5 years after the war's end, the two men met in one brief occasion. It is reasonable to expect that the first and only meeting of these two honored heroes, Picket and Lee, whose lives intersected at one historic instance in our history, should have been one of poignancy and tears, of mutual support, embrace, reminiscence, and regret, postured for the photographer who would etch this picture in history. It was none of those. Instead, it was one of rancor and bitterness. The primary source of this mutual malice between Lee and Picket arose not from the failure of Pickett's grand assault in 1863, but oddly enough, from a shad bake. It was the last week of the war. The flickering lamp of Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia still burned with fitful hope at a place called Petersburg, below Richmond in Virginia. For 10 months, Lee's army had held a perimeter around the city of Petersburg. Lee was surrounded by Union General Grant's Northern Army, and Lee desperately needed to hold the village of Five Forks. It was part of the perimeter. He needed Five Forks in order to secure the last remaining railroad supply line that he has to his encircled army. Lee selected Picket to command the 18,000-man force, which was determined to hold Five Forks, in Lee's words, at all hazards. Before dawn, the rebel troops dug in at Five Forks and waited for the Yankee attack. It was April 1st of 1865. On that morning, General Picket inexplicably accepted an invitation to join two other generals and a number of civilians at a shad bake. He told no one of his plan, which reinforces the complete folly of Pickett's decision to attend the shad bake. Furthermore, it is reported that Picket also was drinking alcohol during the shad bake. Late in the afternoon of the shad bake, the Union Army struck hard, and Pickett's leaderless troops were caught by surprise and overwhelmed. 4,500 Confederate prisoners were taken, and Picket stumbled back to the line too late to halt the rout of his rebel troops. The stampede continued westward to Appomattox Courthouse, where a week later General Lee surrendered and the Civil War was over. After the shad bake, Lee immediately dismissed Picket from the army and placed him under arrest for dereliction of duty. Now, for 5 years, the two men never met one another. During a rainy weekend in March of 1870, General Lee and his daughter took tourist rooms at the Exchange and Ballard Hotel in Richmond in Virginia. Lee was dying, and he knew it. After the war, in those 5 years, he had been president of a small college out in the Valley of Virginia called Washington College, now called Washington and Lee University. Now, with a failing heart, Lee made his last tour to the Deep South. He wished to visit the grave of his father, Light Horse Harry Lee, hero of the Revolutionary War, who was buried in Savannah. On the hotel walkway, Lee met an old friend of his from the war years. It was Colonel John Mosby, Lee's cavalry leader, called the Gray Ghost of the Confederacy. He was quite a hero during the war. By this time, Mosby was a 37-year-old, very successful attorney in Richmond. Lee and Mosby met, they shook hands, they returned to Lee's parlor and held an amiable chat for about 20 minutes. There was no mention of the war. They shook hands and parted, and immediately thereafter, Mosby met General George Picket down in the hotel lobby. Picket, by this time, is selling insurance in Richmond. Mosby told Picket of the meeting with Lee, and Picket said, well, you know, maybe I should like to pay my respect to General Lee, but only if you, Mosby, will go with me. Mosby agreed. According to Mosby, the meeting between Picket and Lee was, in his words, cold, informal, and embarrassing to both. Lee refused to shake Pickett's hand. In a few minutes, Mosby and Picket rose and left, and a biographer of Pickett's states that Picket, quote, brought the conversation with Lee around to Gettysburg, and Lee was furious. Picket felt rebuffed and hurt. Afterwards, out in the hallway, Picket complained bitterly to Mosby about what he called that old man. He said that General Lee had ruined his career in his command. He told Mosby, quote, that old man had my division slaughtered at Gettysburg. Mosby's reply was an adroit gem of wisdom. He said, well, General Picket, it made you immortal, didn't it? Lee died 7 months later in Lexington. In the decade after the Civil War, forgiveness was considered sanctifying, and overcoming sectional acrimony was a national virtue. Americans, North and South, were urged to give absolution to one another. In Mr. Lincoln's words, together we must bind up the nation's wounds. Now, Lee preached this spirit of reconciliation and forgiveness to his students. He believed it, and reportedly, so did Picket. And yet, on an individual basis, these two war heroes could not forgive one another despite their commonalities, including the ill-fated Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Perhaps it is easier to forgive an old enemy than to forgive an old friend. Lee and Picket never met again.